So my game is a 2D platformer. Some of the features in it are an animated player and enemy, a health system, a combat system, a game over screen, moving platforms, and player movement. You move around with the arrow keys to jump and crouch, etc. You're able to attack enemies and kill them. They are able to damage you, as shown there. Um, there's a game over screen when you reach the end of the level, or if you die. The moving platforms are here. I'll just reach the end to show the game over screen. That's it there, and it allows you to restart the game. I have 9 scripts in my game. The first script is called Game Over Manager. It defines a variable called isGameOver. This is static, so it can be accessed at the class level. The next line defines a game object that is attached to the script and calls it Game Over Screen. It then calls awake every time the scene is loaded. This sets isGameOver to false. The update function is called every frame. It checks if isGameOver is true. If so, it sets the Game Over Screen object to active, as it is inactive by default. The function replay game uses the scene manager to load the scene every time the function is called. The next script is game over. It uses the onCollision enter 2D function. This gets called anytime there is a collision with the game object this script is attached to. It uses an if statement to check that flag is the tag of the object in the collision. If so, it sets the isGameOver variable to true. In the previous script, it then disables scripts for moving and attacking, then stops running this script. The next script is called moving platforms. It defines 2 variables, speed and starting position. Both are set in the inspector. It then creates an array of positions called points. The elements in this array are passed in the inspector, then creates a variable called I. When the start function is called, it sets the current position of the game object to the starting position and puts the position in the array. In the update function, it checks to see if the distance between the current position and the position of the first element in the array is less than 0.02. If so, it then increases the I variable by 1. If I is equal to how many elements are in the array, then it resets I to 0. Update also sets the position of the platform by using the move towards function. It uses the current position and interpolates towards the current element that is active in the array while making sure the distance it moves per update is never greater than speed. The next bit of code uses onCollision enter and onCollision exit functions. These set or unset the game object colliding with this object as a child respectively. Next script is player health. First, it defines variables max health and current health. These are both integers. It has 2 colliders attached in the inspector. They're called enemy and player. It also allows me to attach the health bar script. It defines 2 variables as floats, time colliding and time threshold. It has an animator attached to the script. The start function sets current health equal to max health and passes max health into the function called set max health in the health bar script. The onCollision enter works the same way as the one previously mentioned. It uses an if statement to check the tag of the game object as slime. If so, it sets time colliding to 0 and calls the take damage function passing in 20. The onTrigger stay is called every frame and the colliders continue to collide. It checks to see if the tag is slime and then checks to see if time colliding is less than time threshold. If so, it adds the time that has passed since last being called to time colliding using an else statement. It calls take damage passing in 20. It then resets time colliding to 0. The take damage function removes the number passed in from the player's current health. It calls set health in the health bar script and passes in current health. Checks if current health is equal or less than 0. If so, it calls the die function. The die function sets a trigger in the animator, disables scripts for moving and attacking, sets his game over to true in game over manager, then stops running this script. The health bar script has a slider, a gradient, and an image named slider gradient and fill respectively. These are set in the inspector. The set health function sets the slider's value equal to the variable passed in. It then uses gradient.evaluate to see if the color of the image needs to change based on the value of the slider. The set max health function sets the max value of the slider and the current value of the slider using the variable passed in. It also changes the color of the image to the color of the gradient as if the slider's value is max. The next script is enemy slime. This script has an animator and a game object attached to it. It has a max health and a current health variable, both defined as integers. It has 2 floating point variables, time colliding and time threshold. The start function sets current health to max health. When take damage is called and integer is passed in, it reduces current health by that variable and sets a trigger in the animator. It checks to see if health is less or equal to 0. If yes, it calls the die function. The die function sets a boolean in the animator to true, changes the tag of the game object to finish, turns off the collider for the game objects, and then stops running the script. On trigger enter and on trigger stay use tag checks and essentially a timer to see if the animator should play the attack animation. The attack character script has an animator, the position of a passed-in game object, a float variable called attack range, a layer that is defined as enemy layer, and an integer called attack damage. The update function checks to see if the spacebar is being pressed. If so, it calls the attack function. The attack function sets the trigger player attacking in the animator. It then creates an array of elements where the elements are the colliders in the enemy layer that have the drawn circle overlaps. There is a for each loop to go through every element in the array and call the take damage function for the game objects that the collider is attached to. The next script is the move player script. It references the character controller script along with an animator. It also defines two float variables, movement speed and horizontal move. They're set to 20 and 0 respectively. There are two boolean variables called jump and crouch. They're set to false. The update function sets the horizontal movement equal to the movement speed in the direction going along the x-axis the game object is moving. It also passes the player speed to the animator, checks to see if the jump function is being pressed. If so, it sets the jump to true and the script and animator. It uses the exact same idea for crouching, but also uses an else if to see if the crouch button is not being pressed to stop the player crouching by setting crouch to false, and doing the same in the animator. On crouching and on landing both set boolean variables in the animator when called. The fixed update calls the move function in the character controller script, passes in variables. It also sets jump to false. The last script is character controller. It defines a set of variables and lets certain layers, points, and colliders get passed in the inspector. These are serialized fields so that Unity can serialize them without them being public. It then defines more variables as floats. It defines a ridge body, a boolean variable, and defines a variable called velocity as vector 3 and sets all the points in it to 0. It defines Unity events that when invoked call functions that have been passed in the inspector from move player script. On the awake function, it gets the ridge body of the game object, also creates new instances of the Unity events if there isn't any already. The fixed update function sets a local boolean variable called was grounded equal to grounded, and then sets grounded to false. It then defines an array of collider elements called colliders, where the elements in the array use the same method as the attack circle check, but this time for the ground layer. It then uses a for loop that goes through the elements in the array until the current element is the final element. An if statement checks to see if the collider isn't the collider of the game object. If so, it sets the ground to true and invokes the on land event. The move function has a set of parameters that are passed in when called. It checks if crouch is true. If so, it uses the overlap circle method to check if anything on the ground layer is above the game object. If there is, it keeps the game object crouching. An if statement to see if the game object is grounded or if air control is on, checks if crouch is true and then invokes the crouch event and disables colliders. There is an else statement to turn on colliders and stop invoking the crouch event. The next part of the update function sets the vector 3 variable to a vector 2 and sets the x and y of the vector. It then sets the velocity of the ridge body by getting the current velocity, the target velocity, and the time it will take to reach that velocity. It uses an if statement to check the direction we are going, matches the direction the game object is facing. If not, it calls flip. It uses an if statement to check if the game object is grounded and that it is jumping. If so, it sets grounded to true and adds force to the ridge body in the y direction. The flip function swaps the facing right variable between true and false, also flips the direction the script is facing by scaling it by -1 in the x direction. The main issue that I faced when creating my game was with the layers physics system, where certain layers interact only with other certain layers. It caused problems with collisions and detections. The other problem that I faced was with tags and them not being set correctly upon starting the game. As for improving my game, if I was to develop it further, I would make it so that my enemies had an AI potentially to make them move and follow the player within a certain area, and or creating different types of enemies. I would potentially also add a collectible pickup to increase health.